Hello, 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 and welcome back to Murder, She Told. I'm Madison, and we're back again with another very interesting video. As you can tell by the title, we are going to be talking about Lake Lanier, which is a lake in Georgia that is rumored to be haunted, but there are a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to how people discuss this story. So we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson talking about it. It's not, to me, a traditional. It is true crime. I'll say that. The story behind Lake Lanier, there is true crime involved, but we're also going to do some more speculative, spooky kind of conversations about Lake Lanier and the lore about Lake Lanier in Georgia. Specifically, it is highly regarded and assumed to be a very haunted place in Georgia. And we'll get into why as we go further into the video. But there is a true crime story at the heart of this story, so we will be getting into that now. Recently, the Tulsa Massacres have begun to be able to be talked about in mainstream media. Just this past summer, I believe, it was 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Tulsa Massacres, and we were able to really have a real conversation about race massacres, race riots that happened all across the United States in the early 19th century and before then, obviously. But I want to start with Tulsa because if you don't know what happened in Tulsa, essentially there was a bustling community, and it was a bustling black community. There, people owned businesses, they owned their homes, they owned theaters, they owned banks, they owned everything in this one community because obviously segregation. But there was an incident that happened on an elevator, and maybe I'm not going to do a whole retelling of the story, but maybe I will do a video on it because it is kind of an interesting, really depressing story. But essentially, there was an incident between a black boy and a white girl, and essentially she told the townspeople, or she told someone that she had been raped or touched by this young black boy, and basically the entire town erupted into an angry mob that marched to the black section of Tulsa and essentially completely decimated everything. They burned homes. They were burning homes. They were bombing places, firebombing homes. They were shooting and killing people in the street, running people out of the businesses that they owned, ruining businesses, all of this stuff. And it happened all based on something that was not found to be true at the end of the day. And it was, a really, really unfortunate event that people didn't talk about purposefully. At the end of the day, I think over 300 people were murdered that day, and thousands of people lost their homes, businesses, and properties and such, and had to relocate. And basically, we didn't hear about it in mainstream media up until recently because it was intentionally buried by the white residents of Tulsa. A lot of those people were able to gain new land because they ran off all the black people. A lot of those people were able to loot and steal from these businesses. And, you may say, didn't they have insurance on their businesses? But because the town of Tulsa deemed it as a riot instead of a real kind of militarized attack by the white residents, none of those people could get a return on their investment on any of their properties, homes, or businesses. So it was a really, really, really unfortunate situation, but it was one of many situations like that in the United States. It was just one of many, and it just so happened to finally get its day in the sun 100 years later. Now, it started to be talked about more and more. There's a show called Watchmen on HBO Max, which is an amazing, amazing show. Also, the movie's really good. But the show is amazing, and they talk about Tulsa. That was a really, really important aspect of the story, the retelling of Watchmen. So that it started to kind of percolate in popular culture, as well as the show Lovecraft Country. That as well had a segment of Tulsa and the Tulsa massacres and talking about it and, reliving it and all of that kind of thing. So it's been kind of in two really prominent Black-led shows in the past couple years, and the consciousness about the Tulsa Massacre, what really happened, began to kind of permeate throughout. And, people were doing the specials, news people were interviewing people. I believe a 107-year-old survivor testified before Congress about what she wanted to see in regards to the fact that it was finally getting its time of day because she was really young when it happened.
I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire.
Viola Fletcher, still living it. The massacre began the night of May the 31st, 1921. The mob began shooting black people and burning hundreds and hundreds of homes and businesses, even churches. It lasted more than 48 hours. A state commission on the massacre estimates that between 75 and 300 people.
And I say all this to say, and I bring up Tulsa to say that in this country there are millions of stories like that. And if it's not through the experience of the Black residents of this country, it's through the experience of Asian residents, it's through the experience of Native Americans of this land. All of these stories are not unique, and what kind of bugs me is that instead of trying to reapproach history and include all of these stories of racialized violence, white to black people, whether it is destruction of property, lynching, plain threatening of violence, running people out of town, stealing, looting property, all sorts of things like that. Instead of kind of bringing the Tulsa story out and explaining that it's not just this one isolated incident, they kind of reluctantly were like, okay, now we have to talk about it now, so we will talk about it, but we're only going to talk about Tulsa. So today we are going to be talking about a town called Oscarville. And we'll get more into that later in the video. But just know that what happened in Tulsa happened all over the United States to little thriving black communities, to Native Americans, to other people of color throughout our nation's history. And so Tulsa isn't unique by any means. And we're going to get into the story of Oscarville through the story of Lake Lanier. I think it's important to note that a lot of black history is spread orally because we don't really get mainstream recognition about our stories. It's very, very seldom that anything other than the civil rights movement or slavery gets truly discussed openly about our history in this country. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where we are starting to debate what is true and what is false between two polarized sides politically in this country. And we're starting to have this conversation about critical race theory and whether kids should learn about it, when in actuality, critical race theory is a study practice that is most commonly taught in law school, if I'm not mistaken. So, likely elementary school, high school, middle school kids are not learning critical race theory. What we on the left are trying to make more of is to bring out the true history and wipe away the white lies and the white myths that surround the history that we've been told for centuries, and talk about it from a different perspective, and uncovering all of the stories that were intentionally buried by white people, much like Tulsa by its white residents. So I think it's important for me to make a point to say that Tulsa wasn't one of many, and make a point to center stories that people don't really hear about all the time and don't really talk about all the time, especially when it comes to the history of this country and the race issue in this country. So today, like I said before, we are going to be discussing Lake Lanier. And we'll get further into that now. I first heard about Lake Lanier probably during quarantine, and it was trending on Twitter. And I was like, Lake Lanier, like, what the fuck is that? I've never heard of that. And obviously, because I live in California and Lake Lanier is located in Georgia, but people were just talking about different stories. It was trending on Twitter. Something had happened. I believe someone disappeared in Lake Lanier, and a bunch of people from the area who knew the lake were, sharing their stories about, people they knew that disappeared and their bodies were never recovered. People were sharing video of people who dove down into the lake and saw what was underneath the lake, which was a bunch of cemeteries and like essentially an entire town. People were talking about their personal experiences at Lake Lanier and why they don't get into the water at Lake Lanier. And so it started to pique my interest. And I was like, okay, haunted lake in the United States. I want to know more. Is this true? Are these accounts true? Let me kind of Google it. Let me look more into it. So I did. And, at first, it was more of a situation where I was just curious about something, and I was just researching it further to see, the story behind it and why everyone was freaking out about Lake Lanier on Twitter. And, as I read more and more about the story of Lake Lanier, I was like, okay, this could be something for the channel. So I began to research on it. I have my notes here. Boom. And we are going to get to talking about the history of Lake Lanier first, and then we'll talk about the towns underneath Lake Lanier, and then we will talk about my thoughts on whether I think it's haunted or not. So stay tuned. The first thing I heard about Lake Lanier when I was researching it was that it was a man-made lake created in the 1950s, and its use was supposed to be to provide clean, fresh water to the surrounding areas in Georgia. So once I heard man-made, I was like, okay, there's something deeper here. Whenever you hear man-made, assume racism. And I know that sounds crazy, but this country is so petty about race and race issues that when you start to dig into the infrastructure of this country, why there are certain man-made lakes in certain specific areas, why there are certain freeways that go through specific cities, why certain cities don't have clean water, why certain cities don't have a lot of trees, why certain cities, allow factories that create pollution in the air close to suburban homes. All of this kind of infrastructure conversation in the United States is a really interesting one, and race is at the center of it.
Surprised that some people were surprised when I pointed to the fact that if a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or that would have been in New York, was designed too low for it to pass by, that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices. I don't think we have anything to lose by confronting that simple reality, and I think we have everything to gain by acknowledging it and then dealing with it, which is why the reconnecting communities, that $1 billion, is something we want to get to work right away.
Surprise, surprise. So when I heard man-made, I was like, okay, let me find out there is some sort of black town, let me find out that some sort of, community of color was affected by the building of this lake. Let me find out. And I did find that out. So basically, like I said, Lake Lanier was a man-made lake made in the 1950s in around Forsyth County. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, because it did to me when I was originally researching it, and I was like, Forsyth County, where have I heard that before? And what I realized is one of these days back in college, I was in an Oprah show hole on YouTube. I was just clicking old clips of the Oprah show and just seeing who she interviewed and all of this stuff. And there's this one clip that talks about basically the all-white town in the United States, the one of the last all-white towns in the United States. And she goes there and she basically holds kind of a town hall type of vibe situation and starts, interviewing the crowd, asking questions about why they don't want to mix racially, why they're happy to live in an all-white community. It's very racist. It's very racist, just to let you know.
In 1987, the Oprah show had only been on the air for 5 months. Trouble was brewing in the Deep South, in a county where no black person had lived in 75 years. For the first time, Oprah left her studio and headed straight into the eye of the storm.
We bring you today to Forsyth County, Georgia, just 30 miles north of Atlanta, which in the past few weeks has gained the reputation of being a hotbed of racism. Here are just some of the images of Forsyth County in past weeks that were broadcast around the globe.
There's no niggers here. Why should they even come, They asked for it. They got it, so why'd they come back,
But Forsyth is known to be a very, very, very racist and very, very white area. And I was like, okay, now we're getting into some things. Now we're seeing, okay, it's man-made, okay, and it's in Forsyth County. Okay, and my only other reference of Forsyth County is it being one of the only all-white towns in the 1980s, and Oprah going and doing this crazy interview there. Oh, I know this story is about to be crazy. So those signs kept me down the rabbit hole of opening up the onion and revealing layer by layer by layer kind of the deep, dark, kind of suppressed history of what Lake Lanier was before it was Lake Lanier. The reality is this country is super racist to the bone marrow. So everything that this country does politically, infrastructure-wise, education-wise, all of these things have some relation to racism in some capacity, whether it's super intentional or just people at this point have been living this way so long that they don't really notice it. The truth is, racism is everywhere. So we're not bringing it up. It always and perpetually exists in everything that this country has to offer. So we're just pointing it out. So when I'm talking about the fact that, if you trace this country's infrastructure choices, it won't take you long to run into a racist story. I'm telling the truth. And there's a book on it. I believe I will put a picture right here of the book. If you don't believe me, here's a book about it. Okay. There's a whole city underneath Lake Lanier. And, that's how a lot of these man-made lakes go, honestly. They buy out people and, they buy out the people whose houses will ultimately be under the water line. And then they don't always, deconstruct the houses or tear them down. In this case, they just completely flooded the area. And then, those houses and the cemeteries and the tombstones and all of these things stayed intact and stayed under the lake. So what is under Lake Lanier is a collection of small towns that used to exist in the early 1900s. Now, these towns were typically very small farming towns. In the early 1900s, it was actually kind of a barren land. It was hard to farm there. There was some sort of insect problem there. And essentially, the communities that settled there, a lot of them were, post-slavery slaves, and they were really skilled farmers. So they were able to tend the land and prep the land and make it yield crops, even though it was super unlikely that it would because of the fact that it had a bunch of this kind of insect infestation. I think it's called a boll weevil infestation. But suffice it to say, these were small farming communities, and these farmers were highly, highly skilled. And a lot of these farmers were black, specifically when we're talking about the town of Oscarville, which is one of the few towns that were also flooded in that area. Now, the story of Oscarville is an intense one. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of information about Oscarville, which is really sad. It's one of those things where it was buried, the story was buried, obviously intentionally, and the literal city has been flooded by water. So it's not really a story that doesn't exist outside of oral histories passed down through family legacy and generation to generation in the area. So that's probably why you've never heard of it in common, historical knowledge, geographical knowledge. And it was a thriving black community. That's one of the things that I was able to find. It was a thriving black community, kind of like Tulsa. And, they were black farmers. They owned their homes. They were businesses. They were tending and farming to their own land that they owned in the area. And the surrounding towns were a mixture between black and white towns and stuff like that. But Oscarville specifically was known to be a pretty thriving black town in the early 1900s. Like I said before, the information on Oscarville is super limited, so I'm going to be Frankensteining kind of what I was able to get from my sources together to kind of create a semi-complete picture about Oscarville and what it was like and what happened there. After Lake Lanier was completed and fully flooded, Oscarville basically began to fade into distant memories of those who remembered it. So again, oral history and black history are essentially one and the same. So the existence of Oscarville kind of became this phantom that only people who knew about it or who lived near it or who lived there, who left, could kind of pass down to their children and their children's children. Hence why this story is not widely known. But something super, super dark happened actually in 1912, at the very early part of the 1900s, that kind of categorized this area as being kind of a demonic, evil energy kind of space. And this is where the true crime story comes in. Like I said before, this incident happened in 1912. So the kind of expulsion of the black community happened earlier on in the 1900s. And then it was kind of taken over by white people. They were bought out of their homes, and then they filled up Lake Lanier. In 2016, a book was made about Forsyth County and the area surrounding Forsyth County by a man named Patrick Fills. And the book is called Blood at the Root, The Racial Cleansing of America. It's a very good book. There's a really good interview with him through Fresh Air NPR. If you're familiar, you can listen to it for free online. I highly recommend it. It was an amazing interview. And basically, Patrick was a kid who grew up in Forsyth County, I believe in the 80s. His parents were white. He was a white man, and he was a staunch liberal. His parents marched on Washington. His parents, marched for civil rights and stuff like that. And they eventually relocated to Forsyth County when he was young. And he kind of talks about his experience about learning about the racialized history there and the feeling of the public there, and how they were just extremely proud of the fact that they had a very racist and exclusionary history. And so the book kind of centers his personal experience in Forsyth while also peppering in details about what Forsyth County was before Lake Lanier was created. Now, through his research, he was able to kind of find out a story about Oscarville that occurred in 1912, where over 1,100 residents, black residents, were essentially forced out in the middle of the night of their homes and of their businesses and properties in Oscarville due to a situation. The two main circumstances that were quoted in 1912 to have led to over 1,100 black residents being forcefully expelled from the area in Oscarville, centered around 2 accused rapes of 2 white women done by black boys in the area. I just want to pause here. I just filmed my video on Emmett Till, and if you don't know, research that story or wait for my video to drop for me to tell you that story. But this conversation about white women being raped by black men, not saying it never happened, because of course, I would never say it never happened, but that excuse and that lie was proven to be used as a tool to be able to lynch and be violent towards the black community with impunity. This is a similar lie or story that was told that started the Tulsa Massacre. Oftentimes, these are the stories that cause a lot of the race riots and massacres that end up decimating black communities all over this nation. It usually starts with a white woman and a black boy and some interaction. Whether it's true or not, they didn't even take the time to properly figure out and suss out the details. A lot of times innocent men were lynched for no reason based on lies told. A lot of times communities were completely decimated based on this specific lie of a white woman being raped by a black man. And it makes it hard when this constantly comes up as a topic that led to complete and total destruction and subjugation of black people in this country, because, of course, I'm not saying it didn't happen. You know what I mean? I'm sure there are instances that were legitimate where, a white woman was raped by a black man. But I think it's important to also say that, a lot more instances, it was a lot more likely for a white man to rape a black woman. This is called the threadbare lie, and it is something that, black people have been dealing with since the beginning of time when it comes to the rapacious, savage way black men are painted, hypersexual, hypermasculine, all of this stuff all plays a part in how the stereotypes that we even say today of black men are categorized, and why we assume that they are, criminals because of that fact. So to know that whatever happened in Oscarville that pushed over 1,100 residents out of their homes and properties without the ability to sell them or get compensation for them was the fact that 2 situations of a white woman being raped in the town by a black man happened. And there was no real court situation, of course. There's no real justice served. There's no trying to get lawyers to see if this was true or not. None of that happened. It was just someone told someone this. All the white people got upset and decided to take up arms and push people out of the community. So I just want to start there. That's my 2 cents. That's why it makes it kind of difficult with these kind of conversations, because, of course, I empathize with any woman that's been sexually assaulted in any capacity, of course, but in this context, it's so often not true and used as a tool to further degrade or carry out violence with impunity towards the black community that it's hard. When I hear that, I always roll my eyes, and I don't want to, but it's just me being super, super jaded and super cynical about this. So again, another thing, just like Tulsa, just like Emmett Till, and now in Oscarville, a situation where black boys were accused of sexually assaulting 2 white women in 1912. This is a situation where these 2 white women did die and they were brutally raped and attacked. It is a question more so of, did the townspeople just naturally assume it was a black community that was responsible? And because there was no due process, there's nothing that we can say about those cases that is truly factual. We're just going off of what people did after that was known. Do you see what I mean?
It's 4 black teenagers.
According to various accounts, 18-year-old Mae Crow is walking alone in the woods when she's struck repeatedly with a rock, reportedly sexually assaulted and left for dead.
She was hit so hard that her eye was dislodged from her skull and left hanging. She's always kind of sent her.
Debbie Vermont is May Crow's grandniece. She keeps a portrait of her in her living room.
My grandmother always said that she was known to be the prettiest girl in Forsyth County.
Word of the attack spread quickly. Suspicion soon fell on a group of young African Americans. Local media condemned them, describing the trio as, quote, the fiendish, low-browed, gorilla-type Negroes. Enraged by the news, a mob immediately lynched one man.
You believe that some of your distant relatives took part in this lynching?
Yes, some of them I am fairly sure they did. These were the most aggrieved and grieving, who wanted justice for what had happened to their loved one.
2 others, both teenagers, were arrested, tried, and convicted. A prominent doctor volunteered land near his home for the court-ordered execution. An estimated 5,000 people showed up to watch the hangings.
Well, my grandmother would have been 18 months old, sitting in her mother's lap.
Watching someone being lynched?
Right.
So do you believe that those 3 people, the 2 teenagers, the one young man in his 20s, do you believe they were innocent?
I do believe they were innocent. I do believe. And I believe it's a huge cold case that's still sitting there to try.
So they did a night ride to intimidate people, basically wanting, they were naming names of specific black boys that they wanted to be able to, they were accusing of these violent crimes. Of course, like I said, highly speculated whether these boys did do it or not do it, or whether or not they just picked a bunch of black boys and decided that they were guilty. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt from Patrick Phil's interview with NPR about that specific night of what happened after the town had heard about what had happened to this particular case, this particular woman, these particular women. So here we will go. But then in other ways, I find the origins of what happened in 1912 much, much earlier in the county, going all the way back to the Cherokee removals of the 1830s, because that also occurred in Forsyth County. In 1912, a young white woman who was 18 years old named May Crow, who lived really just a few miles from the house where I grew up in, a little town called Oscarville, was found in the woods. I believe it was September 9th, 1912, and she was beaten, bloodied. She had been beaten over the head, and she was bloody and unconscious. At least the newspaper accounts were that she had also been raped, and she was taken to her house and, was in a coma for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, she died from her injuries. The day of her funeral, in fact, that night was the first reported night rioting, and bands of white men gathered together, and they started trying to punish the entire black community for what they believed was, as it was reported in the newspapers at the time, a black insurrection. That was the phrase that was used in the papers, a spree of rapes that was largely just to hysteria and born of fear. But their methods were arson. They burned black churches, they burned black businesses, they set fire to black-owned homes, and they set fire into cabins. They posted notices warning people that they had 24 hours, sometimes a few days, to get out of the county. And over the course of September and October of 1912, this movement spread and ultimately succeeded. And even though in 1910 there were over 1,100 black residents on the census in Forsyth County, by the end of this 2-month period, there was virtually no black people left in the county. Now, I just want to pause and say this, because this was also in the interview. And I think it's important to say the night rides happened, but when she had essentially, or it was essentially widespread knowledge that she had been raped, a couple black boys in the area were rounded up and lynched publicly. And there was reports that someone had taken the shirt off of one of the guys that was lynched, and it was used in the I believe one county building to mark the records of the year 1912. So, messed up. So I just want to say that before the night rides occurred, after she had passed away from her, after these women had passed away from their, violent attack, a couple black boys were lynched and one black preacher was whipped within an inch of his life for trying to protect his community. But these black boys were named as the people who raped and beaten these women to death. They were publicly lynched, where they hung their bodies up to the public flagpole in town, and then everyone was able to shoot their bodies as they rot there. And it was a public hanging, blah, blah, blah. And that's what happened. The reality is a lot of people question whether or not these boys were guilty, of course, as we've said before, about the old threadbare lie. And after that happened, the night rides occurred, and the combination of those two things, not just the lynching, but also the fact that these people were burning down their community and putting notices on their doors about the fact that they should leave. These black people no longer felt safe, no longer felt protected, and left everything they knew, or they were forced out completely because all their property was burned to the ground. And they were completely forced out to neighboring areas. And like I said before, there was 1,100 black people who lived in Forsyth County on the census in 1910. And over the course of 2 months in 1912, all of those people were gone. So, fun. Now, let's get into my opinion. Do I think Lake Lanier is haunted? Now, I've obviously never been there, but I find it really interesting that a lot of people have similar stories about family members that they lost in the lake, friends that they lost in the lake, or weird situations that they felt when they were in the water of that lake. I'm somebody who believes in spirits. I believe in ghosts. I believe in all sorts of things like that. I really do, because I believe that there's, phenomena that we don't understand. So this is why this story was originally interesting to me, because it was spooky and people were talking about real life experiences. I believe the rapper Waka Flocka lost a cousin to Lake Lanier and they never recovered his body. And so many people seconded that, or had experiences where they'd lost friends or other family members, or they'd been in the lake and felt like they were being pulled down underneath the lake, and heard voices by the lake, or just weird occurrences happening due to the lake. So it is common knowledge, and there's been a lot of rumors swirling about whether or not Lake Lanier is haunted. Apparently, since the lake opened in the 50s, almost 700 people have died in the lake and drowned in the lake. At least 8 people die in that lake every year, and some years it's upwards of 30 people die in the lake every year. Now, I'm not an expert, because obviously, there's the ocean, and I'm sure a lot of people die at sea as well. But for this to be a small lake in Georgia that, small meaning not as big as an ocean, I don't know how it kind of plays out comparative to other lakes that are, man-made or not man-made in the United States. But to me, almost 700 deaths seems like a lot. And, the numbers grow every year, because every season people die at Lake Lanier. Some for strange reasons, some just for drowning. A lot of people kind of write it off because that's a hangout spot where people get drunk and like to hang out and, party and stuff like that. And people do dumb shit, of course. But there is still this local lore about the fact that Lake Lanier is 100% haunted, due to what happened in Oscarville before the town was completely flooded. I think the massive intentional violence that happened in 1912 to the black community of Oscarville, the forcing them out of their homes, the lynching, the fact that there's no due process to see if these kids were really legally responsible for what happened to these women and their deaths. I think all of that combined with the fact that people have such a deep fear of going in the water at Lake Lanier. There's a whole mythos around the lake itself in the local Georgia community. A lot of Black people do not go in the water at Lake Lanier. To me, I'm forced to connect those two things in my mind because I'm that kind of person. You know, obviously, you can believe what you want to believe. If you fundamentally don't believe spirits exist and ghosts and all of that exists, and that's your prerogative. I choose to live in the world where that is a reality. And I believe that unfortunately, the violent history that not a lot of people know about, but a lot of locals know about, kind of has tainted the land that Lake Lanier is on. I think that, Oscarville could have been, a Tulsa, not in the sense that was also massacred, but I mean, a bustling city for Black residents, for farming people in alike. I think it was on its way to becoming that because it was a town that had a lot of agricultural achievements with a lot of skilled farmers, and they were making something of their own. They were building community. They were building businesses and homes and stuff like that for themselves to own. And the fact that they were all burned down or completely run out of town over the course of a 2-month period, all because of, and the unfortunate incident that happened with these two women who were allegedly raped and beaten to death by Black kids, which obviously, again, I feel sketchy about that. I feel like that energy is in the soil personally. So, just whatever you believe, and whether you believe the numbers that I stated are big numbers or not big numbers at all, there is definitely a lore and a mythos about Lake Lanier, coupled with its dark history, that has kind of added fuel to people really believing the lake to be haunted. And to be honest, I kind of agree. I don't think if I visited Georgia, I'd go into Lake Lanier. I might go to see it, to go into the water, probably not. There's a fellow YouTuber, their name is Taco Tarantino on YouTube, and they made a personal story about Lake Lanier and their experience and why they believe it's haunted. I'm going to link a couple people's videos down below, just in regards to the fact that I'm a California girl. I heard about this through social media, but these are people who lived in the area, who live in the area currently, and they know the local lore about it. And so I'm going to link their videos down below just so you can kind of get a sense from the local perspective, how people feel about the lake, what people do at the lake, and the energy around the lake from somebody that isn't a Californian just researching on her computer about it. So I'm going to link them down below. Of course, I think that's important to get the local perspective. And like I said before, Oscarville and its history is all but a ghost and exists almost purely in local oral histories that have been passed down. So different videos have different information. Different videos have varying information of the same events. But I think it's important to note that, I Frankensteined what I could find about Oscarville as a town before and what happened there. There are different accounts of what happened there, but I did my best to put them together for this video. And comment down below if you think Lake Lanier is haunted. You tell me. So in conclusion, this is how I feel about it. Like I said, I think that personally speaking, the history, the energy of the land, I think it's possible that the lake is actually haunted, and I would not go into that water. I think that this situation of Oscarville alone and how over 1,100 Black residents were run out of town, and the fact that nobody talks about that, I think that is the bigger story. Before we get to whether Lake Lanier is haunted, I think it's a more important story because this is one of thousands of events that have happened all across the United States to Native Americans as well as to Black people and other communities by white people in this country. A lot of wealth in those areas. If you're from Tulsa and you're reading this, if you're from that area, Forsyth County, and you're a white person reading it, if your family has been there for generations, chances are that they participated in the riots, they participated in the massacres, and likely looted and was able to amass land and wealth because they were super violent to the Black community and threatened to take their lives if they did not leave. So history doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, we are the descendants of both the perpetrators of these violent things as well as the victims of these violent things that occur. And I think that's really important to take into account. Tulsa, Oscarville, there are a bunch of other stories so similar to these, and all over the United States. And I think that's important to remember before we kind of symbolize one story like we're trying to do with Tulsa. We need to understand that this was not a unique occurrence, and it happened every day, all the time, to Black people. They were not even safe in their own communities. What else? Like I've said before, I truly believe that some debts in this country are blood debts, and whether or not you are directly, implicated in these situations, or it was your ancestors, to me, some debts are absolutely blood debts, and it's coming time for those blood debts to be paid, my opinion. So I am not surprised if Lake Lanier is haunted. I personally think it is, and I'm not getting in that water, child. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little story. I hope you enjoyed this true crime story, this kind of spooky story, kind of combination of both. And please like and subscribe and touch that notification bell so you're told when I drop another video. And stay tuned for more. Thank you so much. Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards. Bye.